This is our 19th webinar. We're going to talk about the power of accomplishment-based talent development. And the subtitle, which I don't think was on the registration thing, what we've learned so far. This is very definitely kind of evolving work. And it's evolving to some extent. Those of you who know our work at the Performance Thinking Network know that we see competency-based approaches to performance management, to talent development as problematic because of the level of abstraction that is involved in competencies. And what we sort of discovered, and I'm going to trace that out for you a little bit, is that if you build talent development from hiring through ongoing development, promotion, and so forth around accomplishments, you can have a very effective, measurable, and sort of high traction approach to developing your people. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say somebody is accomplishment-based, because that doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. And then we're going to show you what's evolved in our work, what we call individual performance maps and job descriptions. We used to call these customer diagrams, and some of you old timers probably remember that. How we've begun to think through, and really this was to a significant degree based on conversations some years ago with our colleague Ian Cook about how we can really drive all the different phases of talent development with an accomplishment-based approach. And of course, you know, because we have the Performance Thinking Practitioner Program, which is an organizational performance improvement certification, both for performance consultants, training and development folks, that we can certainly drive organizational performance improvement at the project level with an accomplishment-based approach. And as you'll see just briefly, we even have an evolving executive coaching methodology based on this. So that's kind of the agenda we're going to pursue. But there's a couple other things I want to point out before we go there. First of all, a lot of you have been with us for a while because I recognize your names, and I know some of you personally. But if you want to know more, we have what is really kind of a growing body of work on our YouTube channel, which you can get to through Performance Thinking TV. And so there's some short playlists on things like performance improvement or performance consulting. There's on coaching, on leadership, and there's also some medium-sized videos and presentations. And then there's all of our webinars, which, as I say, this is going to be the 19th one. We've got some more webinars coming up. We're going to talk at some point about change management and how we apply performance thinking to that. How we think about accomplishment-based career path design. We're really excited about this one because Therese Longo from Radcom, with whom we've been working for a couple of years now, has been really doing some interesting work in that area, designing career paths and career ladders using an accomplishment-based approach. Going to talk about onboarding, succession planning, and a bunch of other stuff. Next time, on May 25th, we're going to talk about the strengthening of cultural values. And what we mean there primarily is organizational culture, but it can also certainly be applied, I think, societally, if you will. But we're going to talk about how work has emerged in part from the 7 years that I spent consulting in South Korea up till a few years ago, and also just in general, looking at how people define cultural values and set expectations for how to practice them. So that's in May. We're looking forward to that one. If you want to register, you guys are all obviously registered, but anybody who's watching the recording, if you go to our website at performancethinking.com, or you can also get there via sixboxes.com, and on the homepage, there's this little button that says Performance Thinking Webinars, and you can click there and register. You can also register to be notified of all future ones, which is a convenient thing to do. So I want to do the usual thing I do, which is a little poll, which we have right here. And I want to start that poll. And I'm still trying to figure out how to let you guys see the results, but I'll tell you the results when you fill it out. So this poll is basically a way for me to figure out who's in the room. And so if you could select the description that best fits your function, that would be helpful. Are you a training and development professional, working inside of a company? Are you a performance consultant that's internal? Or are you an external consultant or contractor who could be a performance consultant, management consultant, instructional design person? Are you a CLO or CHRO, a senior person whose job to a great extent is talent management, talent development, a senior leader, manager, supervisor? So There's some others. We never know who the others are. But of course, right now, we got about half the people, about 50% who are training and development pros. And we've got a good number of external consultants and a few senior leaders, which is fantastic, and a few managers and supervisors. All of us, of course, in principle, can be involved in talent development, talent acquisition. So those are the results. Let's see. Not sure if that makes it so you can see it, but hopefully I summarized the data pretty well. That there's now about 40%, 41% training and development professionals, about 35% external consultants, and a smattering of people in the other categories. So that's great. That helps me understand who I'm speaking with here, which is great. Thank you. Now there's also something that you can download here, and I'm going to make that available to you. It's really just a little publication. It's called What It Really Means to Be Accomplishment Based, and it's a PDF. You don't need it to watch this session, but it's something we published a few years ago. Was focused really in the end on accomplishment-based educational approaches, but it sort of frames this notion of what it really means to be accomplishment-based, at least from our perspective. And you can get it also in the resource library at performancethinking.com. But anyway, that's available to you if you're interested in downloading it. I want to mention Shameless Commerce, our Summer Institute, this coming June. We had to skip it for 2 years, and the last one, the 10th annual, was fantastic. It was such a wonderful event. They always are, but we're going to do it again this June. And we've got a few weeks before the discount deadline for $500 discount. You can go to performancethinking.com and you'll find on the homepage a sort of an icon that looks like this. You can click on it to find out more. You can find out what the topics are we're going to be going after this year in the workshops and sessions. And we really encourage you to come. It's a wonderful gathering of people who either are quite experienced in some cases with applying performance thinking in a lot of different organizations, from the professional referee organization of World Cup soccer to biotech to behavioral health to insurance companies to sales organizations, you name it. A lot of different people coming together, sharing the plain language of performance thinking in a beautiful spot with great food and wonderful camaraderie. In fact, Scott Mills, who I think I saw in the group here, has one of the most wonderful testimonials that he gave us last year. If you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see in the testimonials video that we have from 2019, actually, a bunch of folks. Anyway, moving right along. So this is back to the agenda. I want to sort of step through these topics and then hopefully have some time for discussion. So first question is, when we talk about it, what does it mean to be accomplishment-based? What are we really talking about here? It goes back to these two gentlemen, because Tom Gilbert and Joe Harless, who were both important mentors to me, and they were important, thought leaders in our field, to put it mildly. These men brought to the table a really important paradigm shift. Tom published a book called Human Competence, that I'll talk about in a minute, which really set the stage in many ways for the field of performance improvement, along with some of his peers, Gary Rumler and Dale Brethauer and others. And then Joe Harless, who was really a protege of Gilbert and who worked with him and then established his own company, took accomplishment-based approach and systematized it in a way that actually some of the people in this group have practiced and learned from him. Both these gentlemen are no longer with us, but they were an enormous influence on the work that we do. Now, Tom was kind of iconoclastic. I always have to say that, because he liked to upset the apple cart. And in this very famous book, Human Competence, that was published in 1978, but is still taught in graduate schools, it's timeless. He made this rather strong statement. He said, in the great cult of behavior, and he wasn't just talking about behaviorists or training professionals. He was talking about leaders and managers and anybody that has anything to do with helping people perform in organizations. He said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But then he says, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, this was kind of earth-shaking. Not everybody really sort of got it, but those who did began to realize that if we define performance by starting with the valuable accomplishments or products of people's behavior, individuals, teams, processes, etc., and we ensure that they're valuable by being sure they have credible links to organizational or business results, then we're on the right track, because then we're talking about what's valuable. And so the rest of this session is really an unpacking of the implications of that for talent development. But one thing I should add is one of our contributions, small contributions in this field, has been that we use the phrase work outputs as a synonym for accomplishments. And the reason we do that is because some years ago, I looked into the literature. A couple things. One is, and many of you know this, but first of all, if you look up the word accomplishments in the dictionary, you see that more of it has to do with the completion of behavior than with with things that were produced by behavior. And so this, and then the next thing is, if you look into the literature of accomplishment-based performance improvement in the various ISPI journals, in some of the behavioral systems publications, what you'll see is that accomplishments mean a lot of different stuff to different people. Sometimes they mean big business result time, organizational types of things. Sometimes they mean what we would call business results, measured outcomes of, revenue and so forth. Sometimes they mean little tiny things, but it's all over the map. And so, having been trained, by B.F. Skinner and his students to think crisply about performance, we needed a way to define what we would call, in a slightly nerdy way, the units of analysis. So, what is an accomplishment? So, we use the term work outputs, first of all, because it sounds much more explicitly like the product of something, work or behavior. But secondly, because notice it's plural. And as you'll see, we define work outputs or accomplishments as countable nouns. You got to be countable in order to be useful. And so we define performance as having three elements. We say that it's behavior, people's activity, that produces work outputs that contribute to organizational results. And so we always like to use this. I don't see any of my Amgen colleagues here, but I know Gina Restrezzadro, who actually did worked with me last month on our webinar. This soccer girl's famous at Amgen because she's trained hundreds of performance thinking practitioners at that company. And this picture, of course, is not animated, but if it were, she's behaving, right? She's kicking the ball. Now, what she's trying to do is get a goal. That would be the work output or the accomplishment, and it's countable, and it's a thing. And maybe she's kicking the ball to a colleague who's going to head it or kick it into the net. But one way or the other, that's the desired outcome, this work output, which is a goal, a ball in the net. And why? Well, because it contributes to the organization's results, score and winning the game. And so we say that behavior is an action. You describe it with a verb. And that work outputs are things. And this is where we are really insistent that it has to be a countable noun. It has to be a thing which is produced by behavior that we can count good ones or bad ones. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. And of course, once people produce those work outputs, we want to look and say, are they really valuable? Well, do they contribute to organizational results at some level, some success measure or indicator for the whole organization? So that's how we define the elements of performance. And our first simple model is the performance chain. And it just has those elements on it, and it has some examples below each of the elements. And then at the far left are the behavior influences, the things that we frame with our 6 boxes model that influence behavior, that hopefully produce desired work outputs or accomplishments that contribute to business results. And we know that it works left to right. Stuff happens or doesn't happen that affects behavior that hopefully does, or maybe it doesn't produce work outputs because maybe the right behavior influences aren't in place. But ideally, those work outputs then contribute to business results. And we analyze it with the end in mind. So this is kind of well known. People understand the logic of this. There's nothing revolutionary about it, but it's very simple. And this way of thinking can be shared by folks. Now, work outputs are what we're going to be talking about today, accomplishments. And, it really does change everything. Because when you have accomplishments that are sort of vaguely defined, and it might be a business result, might be a change in behavior, might be all kinds of stuff, it's kind of hard to know what to do with that. But once we define it as a thing, that's countable, and especially a countable noun. This leads us to be able to define individual, team, even process performance in a much more precise, measurable, and actionable way. And so that's kind of what I want to unpack over the next few minutes. Now, there's lots of different kinds of accomplishments. This is a list that we teach managers, coaches, leaders, and performance professionals to use. These are not mutually exclusive categories. They're just words that we use when we're interviewing people or looking at performance to be sure we haven't missed any outputs, because deliverables are pretty obvious. They're usually concrete things, documents, widgets, piece parts of some kind. Transactions are a little more fuzzy because they're really the exchange of something. And often both parties to the transaction produce their own outputs, but the transaction itself, a sale, a loan, a bank deposit, you can think of them as transactions. And so don't want to miss those, because those are very important outputs. Decisions are often not even written down, but decisions are really important outputs. You go through a whole set of thinking and talking and work behavior, and then you produce a decision, a hiring decision, a program change decision, a go, no-go decision, whatever it is. It's important, high leverage thing. Milestones and progress indicators are just words that we use to prompt outputs that occur inside of processes, manufacturing processes, or even sales processes, where it may not be strictly linear, but if you accomplish certain things, it moves you toward the final output. Relationships are outputs. You establish and maintain them. They're extremely valuable, both personally and professionally, and we can define good ones in each case. In fact, our webinar on relationships as value accomplishments on YouTube is still the most popular one we've got. It's kind of interesting. Changes and innovations are new things, new ideas, improved processes, suggestions. That sometimes will help people think of stuff they wouldn't have otherwise thought of when they were doing an analysis. Products of communication is a tricky one, because when you ask people a lot of times what their outputs are, some question like that, they'll give you presentations or phone calls, and you say, no, actually, what are those produce? Those are just behavior. So what do you get at the end of meetings? What are presentations supposed to produce? Decisions, business cards, people who clap? What are they? Same thing with phone calls and so forth. So that's an important one, but it's one where we have to kind of wrestle it to the ground, because a lot of times people are stuck on the behavior. Solutions, people who, a good trainer produces people who can now do something different or better at teams. So those, we're not going to belabor these, but this is the scope of the kinds of countable nouns or work outputs that we will be looking at. Now look at this guy. You might wonder why the ad and the slide and everything, why we picked this slide for this guy. And he's pretty happy. And the thing is, when you accomplish stuff, when you produce work outputs, it feels pretty good. I mean, I don't know about you all, but for example, if I'm feeling down on a particular day, or I'm overwhelmed in my office or my house, for me to clean up my desk, to have a clean desk, or to have all my bills in the envelopes ready to go, or to have, new carpet on the floor, it's quite nice, or getting the home network to finally work, actually we got an output. Those things make me feel pretty good. And in the work environment, it's the same deal. You got a good working relationship with the boss. You've got a really good report you just produced. You got, a chunk of code. My son is a software developer, runs without error. That's a big accomplishment. A good hiring decision, company network that works. These are all outputs. And one of the things we know, just among other things, is that when you produce work outputs, it usually feels pretty good for people. So that's why we picked that picture. Now, the word itself is also a great word. And this, I think, had something to do with why Tom Gilbert and Joe Harless's work was so powerful, because people respond to that word accomplishment. It's a positive word. We just redefined it or created the synonym work output because it's more explicitly the product behavior, whereas accomplishment, like I said, if you look it up in the dictionary, it could just be the completion of behavior. And I don't care so much about the procedure being completed. I want to know what produced. So that's why we use the term work output, even though accomplishment is a wonderful word for communicating what we're talking about here. Now, in processes, this is a real simple process map, but inside of processes, there's lots of outputs. So if we're developing a team and we're trying to enable them to be sure to be able to execute, we want to identify those outputs. What outputs at each step in the process are valuable and they get passed on to the next person or the next step. So that's a really important place to look for outputs. But in the end, we're talking about talent development today, and we would say that's usually individual. It's usually about how the individuals in your organization are continuously developing what they need to be able to do the work. And so we're going to focus on the individual, and we have a tool that we call an individual performance map. We inherited this decades ago from Jack Zigan, who was at the time a performance improvement guy, and he used it for completely different reasons. But the idea was you have the performer in the middle, in this case, a sales director, and you got the customers, the individuals, teams, groups, departments, whatever, to whom that individual or that role delivers valuable outputs. And those are the outputs. So this is a tool that we use in analysis. We use it for interviewing people. We use it in our coaching program. It's a really powerful way to have a conversation. As my former partner used to say, it's a lot better than a blank piece of paper because you can define people's outputs. Now, here's an example from a vice president of marketing and sales in a VC-funded tech company. And you can see that she was delivering compelling reason to invest to investors and market analyses and contractual documents and delivering things like products from their company that enable their external customers to develop their new products and so forth. These are outputs of a pretty senior person in a startup. Here's an HR director. You can see this HR director job produces a strategic HR plan, budget, career growth recommendations, a lot of recommendations, various forms, a lot of different outputs to different customers. This is a job of an HR director. Here's a clinical supervisor in a behavioral health organization, and you can see it's not a surprise that these folks are work awful hard because this is a lot of outputs to a lot of different players. And so those of you like my colleague Shane and some of the others who are experienced in the behavioral health world will recognize this as a description of the clinical supervisor's job, who happens to be a BCBA, which is a board certified behavior analyst. Here's a team leader. Team leader develops things like, contributes things like new tools and job aids to her peers, or assignments, or to the operations manager, improvement suggestions, or team development plans. And one of the things is sometimes we produce outputs for ourselves, like up-to-date calendars or checklists. I'd be dead without my calendar, So again, this is a description of a role or an individual's job in terms of the outputs. And then finally, here's a regional director. This is a sort of an in-between level. Saw your comment, Jen. This is a regional director in an organization that's growing, and you can see an awful lot of different customers there. And so, you get the idea. Those are all descriptions of individuals or roles based on their outputs. And it turns out that we can thoroughly and quite crisply define jobs with their accomplishments, the valuable work outputs that those individuals or people in those roles contribute. So that's the foundation idea here. Now, you can turn those into job descriptions. This is a job description, part of a job description that was done by a colleague who was in our practitioner program years ago from Alpha Time, the Dubai-based company. They have like 75 different businesses, big organization all over the Middle East. And it turns out in each of those organizations, there's these various levels of managers. And you probably can't even read this very well. I apologize for that. But the idea was she did analysis by interviewing this level 2 manager across a bunch of the business units. And she found that they all had to produce strategic plans, lists of standards, clear expectations for their people, business review plans, business review presentation set, a team that's aligned and on the same page. And you can see, you probably can't read it again, but the second column there are criteria. Like, what does it mean to be a good one, a good strategic plan, a good succession plan? So this was quite interesting to me at the time. This was an early insight. Again, this is probably 6 years ago or so, where we started to say, wait a minute, this is a fairly generic model in the sense that we've taken this kind of manager who works in a lot of different businesses, and we can define at least the outputs that are common to that level of manager across all these different operating units. And then here's a little bit simpler one. This is the simple job of major accomplishments of a payroll specialist. And it's formatted a little bit differently. We didn't produce any of these. This is clients and colleagues and people who've been through our practitioner program. And here you got the output: payroll, responses to requests, proactive recommendations, client-facing reports, client relationship. Now, this job may have some other outputs, but these are main ones, really critical ones that define the successful payroll specialist. And it's got criteria down the right. So another example of a job description. You can go that direction if you want to really get into specifics. Now, one of the things, and I don't want to belabor this one, but if you see what I've just shared with you, this is a lot more powerful than relying on competencies. Because when you define a job in a job description by competencies like communication excellence or strategic thinking or whatever, the only thing you can do is rate people. Are you a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 on strategic thinking? Now, my stupid joke about that is that, it depends on whether the guy had his cup of coffee in the morning, and that's probably pushing it. But the point is, that kind of rating is subjective. It's very much subjective. It's what one of my late mentors, Eric Cotton, used to call refined opinion. Whereas if we look at accomplishments, we can talk about, did you produce a good succession plan? Did you produce a good treatment, plan? Did you produce a good budget, a decision, or whatever it was? You can actually get very specific. You can look at instances, you can look at accomplishments or work outputs, and you can count them. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So counting accomplishments that meet criteria is an objective way to look at performance. And I don't want to belabor the competencies thing, but this really is, it doesn't even have to be an alternative to competencies. We have a place for competencies in our 6 boxes model, but in terms of defining performance, it's a lot more concrete to go in the direction of those pictures that I showed you a while ago as individual performance maps. So if you have accomplishments, if you've defined a job or a team's performance for that matter with accomplishments, first of all, and I'm going to try to show you some of these things, you can connect people to the success of the organization. You can much more easily say, if you produce this, this will make a difference. You can also create, at the very beginning of talent development, you can create behavior-based questions for hiring interviews. Everybody talks about how behavioral interviews are one of the most important components of a good hiring process. Well, if I can ask you, have you ever produced a strategic plan, or how about a improved relationship with a tough employee? How about a decision about whether to fund something? Et cetera. If I can say, hey, have you ever produced one of those? What was that like? What was challenging? You can do beautiful front-end behavior-based questions for hiring. You can also have performance tests, because if you have some critical outputs and you want to be sure somebody can do that, it's like when my son is a software developer, and when he was originally starting to apply for jobs, they put people through a lot of times in the hiring process, they give them some stuff to code or to figure out the algorithm or whatever, and it's a real output. And so you can build performance tests in the front end too. You can also, as you ramp people up, as you go from week 1 or day 1 to week 2 to month 2 to et cetera, you can figure out what accomplishments or outputs people need to be up to speed on sooner rather than later, and you can manage and design your ramp up, your onboarding process in that way. And then, of course, as Joe Harless showed us with his accomplishment-based curriculum development approach, you can design performance-based training, coaching, and other processes. So I want to unpack some of these things a little bit. The first thing is, this guy is pointing with some excitement to his work output and how it contributes to business results. Something we recognized a long time ago, and it became more obvious when we started developed a management program and then a coaching program, is that if you can sit down with an individual and say, this form that you fill out every day, or this decision that you have to make a whole bunch of on a daily basis, if that's done well, that's going to contribute to regulatory compliance, or to customer satisfaction, or to operational efficiency, or maybe to profits. And it's not that hard, usually, if you can define the thing, to draw a credible link from work outputs to organizational level results. It's a lot harder to say, if you ask a lot of open-ended questions, or if you're really nice to people or whatever, if you describe behavior, it's sometimes harder to make a real line of sight to business results. But if you can point to how that output credibly contributes to a result, or in some cases, if you can say, hey, if that's not produced up to spec or on time or fully, up to right quality standards, what will suffer? It makes sometimes people way sort of down in the trenches, so to speak, much more aware and cognizant of how they make a contribution. People like that. Now, there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about around engagement in an accomplishment-based approach. And if you look on our YouTube channel, you'll find a couple of our webinars ago, we spent an hour on this topic, so I'm not going to drill into it. But it turns out that you can really drive engagement and retention of people when you start with accomplishments, and then you also use our other piece, the 6 boxes model, which I'm not going to really talk about much today. So if you want more, you can go find a lot more there. Now, if we talk about accomplishment-based talent management or talent development as a whole, and that's what this session is really about, the focus on accomplishments gives us a more precise and specific and measurable way to manage and develop people. So first of all, we can define jobs. We can create performance tests. We can identify good questions for behavioral interviews with accomplishments. I think I already mentioned that. And so at the very beginning of the recruitment hiring process, which of course everybody's challenged with right now because of the Great Resignation and all of that, that's a place where if you just shift the focus to the accomplishments that that job or that role needs to produce, you can build a very nice front end to your hiring process. And then, depending on what onboarding means, that word means a lot of things to a lot of people. And some of the Korean companies I worked with, it was a 6-month process that went through all kinds of stuff. Some places it's just a meeting. But if you think about onboarding or ramping people up at the beginning of their tenure in a job, then if we know what all those accomplishments are, those work outputs that somebody needs to produce, we can over time, as managers, supervisors, trainers, HR professionals, we can help people focus on the stuff they need to be up to speed on sooner rather than later. We can delay the stuff that they don't do so often till later. We can do things like create job aids for things that aren't done very often, so we don't have to focus on training. In other words, we can design and tweak our onboarding or ramp-up process for new employees if accomplishments are sort of on the checklist. And that's, I think, a big deal too, because people often don't have a good way of doing that. It's real hard to do with competencies, like when are we going to be working on strategic thinking or communication excellence? But I know when we might be working on hiring decisions or relationships with the other department or budgets or et cetera. When we've got specific concrete outputs, it's a lot easier to tell people what to focus on as they come up to speed on their jobs. And then job readiness, if that's an extension of onboarding, we can set very clear expectations for what we want people to be able to produce. We can give them feedback. We can provide tools and resources. We can arrange recognition. We can be sure they have the right skills and knowledge. In other words, we can apply the 6 boxes model to developing and improving performance as people get ready, not only for their jobs when they come on board, but when there's a new project, when there's a new opportunity, when there's maybe a career path opportunity, or we're going to export talent from our team and this person's going to become a manager. We can get focused on the accomplishments and develop people that way. And so, for example, for training, instead of having behavioral objectives, we can say at the end of this training, you'll be able to produce whatever it is, a strategic plan in the form that we do it around here, a budget, a relationship, a better relationship with your colleagues, decisions about funding or non-funding, completed forms, solutions for customers. We can get very specific with outputs as the objectives of our training and development efforts. And once we're there, we can also move people into a coaching process. And I want to talk a little bit more about this, but the idea is that if we are coaching people based on the accomplishments, the outputs that they need to produce for their customers, for their team, for the next business situation, we can put people into a regular cadence of check-ins with their supervisors, which starts out with an individual performance map to get clear on expectations, and then which over time addresses the stuff that's most important, the things that need improvement, the things needed for the next project or next quarter, the things needed to move up on the career path. We can have an ongoing talent development cycle that is sort of quarterbacked, if you will, by the supervisor or manager as coach. And from that process, of course, we can identify when people are ready for promotions or transfers to other departments that have other requirements, or as they say, export talent. Actually the first company we ever introduced our management development program in over a decade ago was a high-tech company based in Tampa, Florida. And their managers had kind of a mantra of exporting talent. And the idea was you got a good team. It was a high-tech company. You got a good team, and some of these people are fit to be managers. And so as painful as it is to get rid of some of our great people, if we can make them available to be managers of other teams, that's a valuable thing for the whole organization. So that's what we mean by exporting talent. And of course, you can look at people's annual compensation review. Instead of saying, oh, you're about a 4.3 on competencies, you can say, no, these are all the things you can produce. And you added some important new stuff this last year, which qualifies you for a higher pay grade or what have you. So you can drive the whole thing with an accomplishment-based approach once you've defined the work outputs in that job. Now, part of what got me thinking this way, and you can go find this on the Harvard Business Review website, they have all their past issues available to read, is there was an article in the Harvard Business Review in 2008 called HR Goes Agile. And it was my introduction to the concept or the phrase agile talent development. And the idea is pretty simple. There's a lot of stuff in the article, but what it caused me to recognize and what it said was companies that are really doing the best job on talent development and who are enabling their people, their departments and the whole company to keep up with the speed of change. You know, in contrast to we're going to have a quarterly learning plan or, you know, whatever, which usually doesn't keep up very well with the speed of the way things are moving these days. And not only that, but if you, for example, think about the webinar we did last month with Gina Restor-Zadra on learning in the flow, whereas it's not about taking people out of the job to go to a training session. That might be part of it, but where it's about a manager and the employee having conversations about what they need next, and then pointing them to resources, which could be anything from a website to in fact, a formal training program, to some new job aids, to paying closer attention to the standard operating procedures, to go spending a morning with Joe because Joe really knows how to do this. There's lots of ways that a manager or supervisor and the person that they work with can gather resources to focus on developing particular outputs. And what this said is that the best companies doing agile talent development to keep up with the pace of business are putting development very largely in the hands of coaches, supervisors essentially, and managers who are coaching their people. And that was a big deal. That kind of confirmed what was vague for me and became really explicit once I read it. So it's a good read. And on this topic, Shane Isley, who I think is with us today, and I did a session quite a while ago that you can find on our YouTube channel about our approach to coaching, which, as you might guess, is accomplishment-based, because it's about developing a cadence of conversations with the people that you supervise or manage about how they're doing on the work outputs that are important to their business, to their work, to their team, to the organization, and how we continuously develop those with a focus on the valuable contributions rather than on skills, knowledge, or competencies only. So again, if you want to know more, check out the webinar. And Shane had a lot of good things to say. He's been teaching people how to do coaching now for quite a long time, both in his previous companies that he owned and also now as a full-time performance consultant. And it's a big lever. It's a big opportunity to develop people. Now, we've already mentioned this, but it's worth pointing out that most of the work I've mentioned is really individual level. It's about helping individuals to perform better. And especially in the era of things moving fast, it makes a lot of sense to sort of customize and tweak it by having the manager and the employee kind of figure out what the next important thing to improve is or develop or add and go in that direction. But of course, you know, our mother of all programs is our performance thinking practitioner program, and you can do projects. So if you take our two models, which is the performance chain that you've already seen, and the 6 boxes model, which is rather tiny there, but it's our plain English evolved version of Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model. And you say, in any conversation about a project that we might undertake, or an initiative, or a program, or a change management challenge, let's be sure we know what's at stake for the business. Let's start there. Then let's look at the performance of the individuals, the processes, the teams, whoever it is, and identify the work outputs through interviews and observation and so forth. and be sure those work outputs contribute to business results, because if they don't, they might not be worth, keeping around. And then once we know what those outputs are, let's take a look at what behavior is required. And one of the best things you can do for that, is my old colleague and friend Paul Elliott and his partner talk about in their book. You can do exemplary performance analysis. You can take a look at the really top performers and how they produce those outputs. And a lot of times you can capture some important best practices that you might not have discovered if you hadn't focused on top exemplary performers. Or you can do task analysis, or you can use sort of what's known as best practices. But the point is, you're focusing on the behavior needed to produce the work outputs. Then you can look at measurement. Like, we get to measure business results. That's fine. That's an important thing, but they're lagging indicators. We get to measure behavior. Maybe that's important sometimes, but it's kind of expensive to do. So you do it for feedback and diagnosis. We can measure work outputs more easily. We can count work outputs that meet criteria. Once we got that in place, we can look at the behavior influences. And if we're doing projects, as people here, there's some certified practitioners in this group here, we can have conversations about what's working and what's not working in each of the cells of the 6 boxes to produce the behavior needed to contribute the work output. And then we can brainstorm possible improvements, and then we can choose which ones we can configure and our best shot at making a difference. And then, of course, because we're not always perfect, we can implement it, measure it, and adjust it, which is the sort of agile, iterative process. Now, this is a logic that has driven performance improvement projects now for decades. Certainly people that I've trained and worked with, places like Amgen, sometimes it drives 3-year huge projects. And of course, we can coach individuals this way. But this is how we approach things like training and development projects that might apply to developing the talent across a whole bunch of people, like initial training programs and such. We can even do executive coaching. And this was a discovery we made in about 2015, and we did a bunch of R&D with it with a bunch of senior leaders in a lot of different companies. And just before COVID, we were actually about to launch a certification process for teaching mostly existing executive coaches who use a lot of other methodologies, which are great. They're more like therapeutic or open-ended question, problem-solving kind of things. But it turns out, if you do an accomplishment-based individual performance map for somebody like, in this case, this is an old colleague of mine, actually, who was the CEO of a large school, which was recently acquired. I mean, a whole line of schools in Ohio, actually. But what you see here is based on a conversation with a senior leader about what their contributions are. And you'll notice that a lot of their contributions are things like goals or feedbacks or answers. A lot of their contributions are actually outputs that function as behavior influences for the people that they lead and manage. So you can have the conversation. We've identified all these. And for starters, usually executives, when they see their jobs laid out this way, are kind of stunned a little bit, because they say, wow, you got my whole job. And there's a bunch of decisions in here too. I don't know if there are in this one, but usually when you're working with senior people, a lot of decisions come out of it. And decisions are extremely high leverage outputs for senior leaders. And then you can start asking questions. We're not here to improve your performance. What we're here is to help you have visibility into your performance so you can make decisions about optimizing it. So which of these things are the most important and the most high leverage? Which ones consume most of your time? Are they the same or different? Could you delegate any of the less and the ones that don't actually require you? Do you have a succession plan? This is one of my favorites, because most of the senior people I've spoken with don't necessarily have a succession plan in place, and we can build it if we look at outputs in a very straightforward way. Given that a lot of these outputs are passed on to your team members, your executive team that worked for you maybe, or their folks or managers, like, how are they responding? Is this working for them? Are the goals that you set for them clear enough? Are you providing recommendations or assignments or feedbacks that actually work? And also about the processes, because you're contributing to a lot of processes in your organization. Like, how's that working for you? And so forth. So my point is, we can even extend the notion of talent development to the most senior people in an organization and help them to identify opportunities for for becoming more effective and efficient and so forth. So that's kind of most of what I want to say. I want to talk a little bit about measurement, just in simple terms. One of the nice things about outputs or accomplishments is that if we define the criteria or the characteristics of a good one, we can count them. So we can say to an individual, like, how many new outputs or improved outputs you got this quarter? And we can also go to a manager who's managing and coaching a team, and we can say, how you doing? How are your team developing? Which ones can we count them? How many improved decisions? How many new documents? How many, et cetera. And we can also, if we're interested in looking at return on investment, knowing that formal training is often pretty expensive, we can start to look at, well, how many of these outputs were produced primarily as a result of some training program? And how much of them were produced ongoing coaching with supervisor and manager kind of being the quarterback of it? Because that's going to have ramifications for the return on investment in talent development. We can also look at productivity. We can look at how quickly people get up to speed. We did a project at AT&T Wireless some years ago with customer service reps, and by getting very explicit about the outputs and then the behavior and then building fluency in that behavior, we were able to take their onboarding or their ramp-up program. It used to take 2 months to go from new customer service rep to person meeting productivity and quality expectations for the organization. It used to take 2 months. We got it, so it took 2 weeks. And that's by configuring the behavior influences to optimize production of those outputs. So that's a pretty big deal. You can manage and speed up productivity. You can also, look at promotions. You can look at how rapidly people are. If you think of human capital as the contributions that people make, you can quantify that. It's a lot easier to count outputs. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse here because, among other things, it's not dead, but counting accomplishments is a lot more credible and actionable than rating people on competencies. And, just to put in one more little thing about that, I can't tell you how many people I've spoken with in organizations who go through the standard performance management evaluation process where they get rated, are you a 4 or a 5 on this? And they hear things like, or I've heard from senior managers too, well, we can't give them all 5s because it's kind of like grading on a curve, or we want to give them room for improvement. Like, what does that mean? At that point, it's not measurement anymore. And what happens is employees get pretty cynical about that. And that's why you see all these articles out there about, publications about how performance management in its traditional way doesn't work so well. So what we think is building talent development and performance management around accomplishments is a lot more credible, a lot more, if you will, confidence building. So here's some takeaways, and then I want to have a few minutes to see if you guys have questions, comments, observations, examples, whatever. First of all, you can create accomplishment-based individual and role-based job descriptions. I think I showed you enough examples to hopefully persuade you of that. We can then, as I showed you with that process, we can at every step in the talent development process, we can look at accomplishments as a guide, as a foundational way to think about talent development and to move through people from new hire through promotion. We can also, in doing that, if we put this in the hands of our managers and if we teach our managers accomplishment-based performance coaching, we can enable agile talent development to be going on at that level, at the front lines, if you will. And we can build a culture around that. In doing so, we've enabled, or can enable, leaders and managers and supervisors to get much clearer with their people about what I need session notes that meet these criteria and look like this, and we're going to work with you until you've got really good, reliable outputs here. We can set expectations in that way, as it's saying, well, you should get a lot clearer on your writing those sessions. What does that mean? I don't know, but I do know what a good one looks like, so we can focus on that. And we can therefore and thereby connect people up to the organization's success, because with outputs, as I said earlier, it's a lot easier to say, you know what, this credibly contributes to customer satisfaction or to regulatory compliance or to safety. Or if that's not obvious, what happens if you don't produce it up to standard? Oh, well, then we know what suffers. So you can make that connection with people a lot clearer. And we can also count accomplishments that meet criteria in a way that underlies a talent development or talent management metrics that I think people will find much more actionable and straightforward. So just one last shameless commerce bit, which is that we have our ongoing open performance thinking practitioner program, which is where we certify people as performance thinking practitioners, which are basically process, learning and development, HR, and other folks who do projects, training and non-training projects. You can look at our homepage and see where to do that. The next one starts May 24th, just so you know. And so that's my story. You know, you can go to performancethinking.com, our website, and look for stuff. But I invite you, if you're still with us, and I'm looking. Yeah, we still got our attendees. Glad to see it. Comments, questions. What do you think? Anyone? Hey, come on, man. I'm hoping you're still there. Hey, Shane, are you present? Would you, can you maybe add some stuff in the chat box? Only because you've had so much experience with this stuff. Oh, here's Scott saying, any litmus test for getting the right level of detail for accomplishments to build talent development progression? I don't know enough, Scott, yet about that. That's a really good question. Thanks, Gordy. It's a really good question, Scott. What we find is that if you do an individual performance map at the level of an individual, and again, it depends on whether you're trying to define general job descriptions or define the job of an individual. But in either case, if you can have an individual performance map and you look at it and people say, yep, that's you got most of my job here. Or if you look at it from a supervisor or managerial point of view and say, yep, this is all the important stuff. Now, one of the things we've had a bunch of clients develop formal job descriptions using accomplishments. The one that I mentioned in Dubai, we've had some behavioral health organizations do so. We had one develop like more than 100 different, what they call performance expectation tools, but they were basically lists of outputs for each job description. It's a lot of work to do that for everybody from an HR organization point of view. And I'm not 100% sure that it's worth formalizing the job description level of it. I don't know for certain about that unless it's a big job description and we're building onboarding programs and there's a whole bunch of people in that role. Obviously, then you want to say, these are the critical outputs that this job needs to be able to produce. Sometimes, for example, level of detail, Scott, sometimes there's a bunch of decisions. Decisions becomes a whole category. And so what you might do is you say, there are types of decisions, here's the main 4 kinds. Or the same kind of thing for solutions. Like if you're looking at customer service reps or tech support people, you can probably categorize the types of solutions at a level that's fine enough detail to include some variations, but enough so you can define what a good one is. So I think it's an empirical question. I think it varies a lot depending on what the job description is. But what I was going to say is, for me, the ideal scenario would be if we could have a technology, and we don't have any organizations yet that have that, where we had coaches and managers who are having ongoing conversations with their people, first defining their individual performance maps, probably putting those into a system. And then when they worked on one output at a time, defining the criteria and some of the best practices behavior, and maybe even some of the behavior influences they use to improve it, and put that into a database so that instead of having whole job descriptions, you could pull one output at a time from that database, and you could configure them in collections. I think the bottoms-up approach might be a more powerful and agile way to do that than trying from the top down from HR, where you have to have some regulatory issues taken into account and stuff like that. So I know that's a rather long response. I don't have a clear litmus test for it, other than you look at it and you say, this looks like it captures the job. And there may be some refinements we can do within some of the categories, but we sort of got it here. When evaluating coaching, training, planning, and measuring using work outputs. So Don, I'm not sure if that's a statement or a question, but I agree all of those things using accomplishments can be a heck of a lot easier if you're looking at accomplishments. So the challenge for me was skill mapping. It isn't. There's a difference between skill mapping and accomplishments, Michaela. It's, skills are behaviors, basically. They're the ability to do stuff. I want to know what the valuable product of that is. So usually a skill is somehow defined with verbs as a general set of, capabilities for producing something. If you focus on the accomplishments of that job, that role, first of all, it'll be a shorter list, almost guaranteed. But secondly, it makes it a lot leaner because you can now focus on the valuable thing that you need somebody to be able to produce. There may be one skill or there may be a bazillion skills, but whatever it is, it defines the value that they contribute. So I would encourage you, and it's hard to do this because defining outputs, as people who've been through our practitioner and coaching programs will tell you, is a lot harder than it looks. But I believe that if you're going as far as doing role-based skill mapping, go to the next step and look at the products of those skills. If they have this skill, what will they be able to produce? That's, to me, the interesting question. So, Don, instead of only behavior supports a non-expert in coaching next, yes! The question is, can a specialist be coached for improvement by someone who is not an expert in that role? That's a really good point, Don. That is I can tell you've been around for a long time. That's a really subtle perspective. I think you can, because the hardest part that we didn't talk about at all, we teach people to look at work outputs and then try to come up with a set of ideally 5 to 7, what we call criteria for a good one, characteristics. Might be, if it's a document, it might be, meets all the criteria that are defined in the template and job aid. It might be within, X amount of time. There are a lot of criteria or characteristics. But if we can define the characteristics of a thing crisply enough so that there's not a lot of open room for interpretation, I believe you can get a relatively newbie person who at least has never done the job, if it's a collaborative conversation also in a coaching environment, much closer. This is not an evaluation thing where I'm going to look at your work and tell you if you did any good or not. This is a collaborative effort between a supervisor, manager, and somebody who works for her or him to try to continuously improve. So I think you're right. I think a specialist can be coached for improvement by someone who's not an expert as long as it's a collaborative effort. And if you can pull in other people as needed, I think so, but I don't have enough experience to make that as a general statement. I think, competency-based. Yeah. I think accomplishment-based, Scott, works pretty well. It's a word that people kind of feel good about. And the only challenge is defining it technically, which is why we created that phrase, work outputs. Competency-based means who knows what. My colleague, Tina Rescue, wrote a paper, 15 years ago, called Competence is What Matters. And I was a co-author, but I just put in a paragraph or two, but she really drove it forward. And she was talking about Tom Gilbert's use of the word human competence, meaning basically being able to produce accomplishments. And so she was contrasting competence with competencies. And I think the discrimination is a little bit tough for most people. So accomplishment based is much nicer. It's one of the things that I think Joe Harless did very beautifully. Initial data articles will be helpful in getting senior leadership on board. It takes some time. What I think, Michaela, is that you're not going to stop your thing that you're working on now. It would be, as you're suggesting, you got a big organization. But I think you can do some pilots. Of course, I'd love to talk with you and have you or some of your colleagues go through our practitioner program to really nail this thing down and do a project. But one approach is to try it with a few jobs or with a few, maybe you do your skills-based thing. And then you have a second conversation, which is you say, okay, if this person could do these things, what would they produce? And maybe you can shift to having an individual performance map and then see, maybe even compare and contrast it in a sort of a pilot environment if you can. That's one way. This stuff usually is kind of viral. It doesn't happen usually, even if senior managers say, we're going to do it this way. Usually it takes time because it's a big shift. But I think that, a good person to reach out to might be Gina Restor-Zadro, although she's not precisely a talent development person. She runs their performance consulting, training, but it is training organization, training and performance, or learning and performance. And she's in a giant company, and over about a dozen years, they've become quite accomplishment-based. Anyway, I really appreciate your questions and comments, everybody. And I think it's probably about time to wrap up. But hope this was useful. And again, check out performancethinking.tv for more videos. And this is getting recorded, and it'll be up. And there'll be a link sent out to all of you within about 36 hours that will take you to the recording in case you want to share it with people. So thank you, everybody. I think we're done.